Breaking news in our Law and Justice lead, and a major update from the U.S. Supreme Court on that Texas redistricting case. You'll remember Republicans in the state, in an unusual mid-decade review, redrew the maps, the congressional maps, earlier this year. Let's get right to CNN Chief Supreme Court Analyst Joan Biskupic. Joan, what is the latest news from the U.S. Supreme Court?
Very big news, Jake, both politically and legally. The Supreme Court, the conservative majority over the dissent of the three liberals, has said that Texas can use the map that it drew last summer.
A Republican redistricting scheme designed to cement their power for a generation, starting in Texas, has triggered a chain reaction across multiple states that could end up costing them the very House majority it was meant to protect. This entire saga traces back to a very vocal demand from President Trump himself. He wanted Texas to redraw its congressional lines to squeeze every possible advantage out of the map, to build a fortress that would withstand any Democratic wave. The Republican-controlled legislature dutifully complied.
This district court had said that, and Texas had come up here and appealed it, backed by the Trump administration. Today, the Supreme Court majority said no, that this map deserved more deference from the district court. The district court should have taken into account a presumption of legislative good faith. That's been a standard that Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito have been really pushing over the years, to sort of let states do what they want to do, even if there could be a cloud of
drawing boundaries designed to favor their candidates and protect their incumbents. It was supposed to be a masterstroke, a preemptive strike against the historical pattern of the president's party losing seats in midterm elections. The architects of this plan were confident they had built something permanent, something that could weather any storm. Roughly 1 year later, that confidence has evaporated into panic. Harry Enton, the data wizard who crunches numbers for CNN, has been tracking the trajectory of Republican chances.
States' newly redrawn congressional maps can stay permanently. The Supreme Court today overturned a lower court's ruling. The justices sided in favor of Texas Republicans, who changed the boundaries at the president's request to give the GOP 5 more House seats. Back in November, a lower court ruled the maps were racially gerrymandered to disenfranchise black and brown voters.
Since that Texas redistricting moment, the graph tells a story of catastrophic collapse. When the lines were first redrawn, the prediction markets gave Republicans a 33% chance of holding on to the House of Representatives. That's not great odds to begin with, but it was something to work with, a foundation to build upon. Now look at where those numbers have gone. They haven't just declined. They've plummeted off a cliff into the abyss. We're talking about a 14% chance.
What basis does the majority have to thus substitute its understanding of the direct evidence for the district courts? The short answer is it has none. So this is the end of the line for this Texas map. It can be used going forward now for the midterm elections, Jake.
All right, Joan Biskupic, thanks so much. Let's bring in CNN's Jeff Zeleny and also CNN senior legal analyst Ellie Honig. Ellie, your reaction?
Well, Jake, this is going to have major consequences for the 2026 midterms, as the justices appear to acknowledge.
A collapse so severe it's almost hard to process. Despite firing the opening salvo in Texas all those months ago, Republican chances of maintaining control have absolutely cratered. Down they go into the water, and there's no life preserver in sight. The national environment has shifted in ways that make gerrymandering almost irrelevant. A rising tide lifts all boats.
That's also, it's important to understand, this is not just some procedural stay. Sometimes we see the Supreme Court say, we're just putting it on hold for now. The 6 conservatives in the majority here say Texas likely will ultimately win on this issue. And as Joan said, the disagreement here is this new map a racially based gerrymander? The 6 conservatives in the majority seem to say no, and the 3 liberals, in a furious dissent, it's 17 of the 20 pages of this ruling, say, yes, this was a racial gerrymander. It should have been struck down.
And right now, that tide is a Democratic tsunami. The generic congressional ballot tells you everything you need to know about where this country is heading. Back when Texas first redrew its maps, Democrats held a lead on that generic ballot question, but it was just 3 points. A respectable advantage, but nothing that couldn't be neutralized through clever line drawing and strategic candidate recruitment. Since that moment, something fundamental has changed in the American electorate. That 3-point Democratic lead has doubled. It has surged to 6 points, a margin that overwhelms even the most sophisticated gerrymandering schemes. Here's the cold mathematical reality that Republicans are now confronting. You can only redistrict so many seats.
What this ruling does not do, however, though, is affect these individual races. These races still have to be won. And this does not change the environment on the economy. This does not change the environment on what voters think of the Trump administration, local issues as well. So what this does is basically reverts back to what the thinking was all along, that the Republicans in Texas were going to have an edge here. Of course, that set off a nationwide, unprecedented.
There's a limit to what map manipulation can achieve when the national mood swings decisively against you. 6 points is not a margin you can gerrymander away. 6 points is the kind of lead that swamps carefully drawn districts, that turns supposedly safe seats into battlegrounds, that makes incumbents who thought they were protected suddenly very vulnerable. And here's where the story gets even worse for the GOP. Not only has the redistricting effort failed to deliver the advantages they anticipated, but Democrats have actually gained more seats through the redistricting process. Overall, the national environment has moved decisively against Republicans at the exact moment their structural advantages are proving insufficient. A 6-point lead for Democrats is the kind of number that makes party strategists pump their fists and declare they're getting that majority back. It's the primary reason Republican chances have gone way, way down while Democratic prospects have soared. The picture becomes even clearer when you examine individual seats rather than just the national environment. Organizations like Inside Elections and the Cook Political Report conduct meticulous seat-by-seat analyses examining each district's fundamentals, candidate quality, fundraising, and historical voting patterns. Their assessments reveal a transformation that should terrify anyone invested in continued Republican control. On the day Texas redistricted, Republicans actually held an edge in terms of potential seat pickup opportunities. When you counted toss-up seats and those leaning in their direction, Republicans had a lead of 8. That advantage has been completely reversed. Democrats now hold the lead, commanding a net pickup opportunity of 12 seats. That represents a 20-seat shift, a net movement in the Democratic direction so massive it's hard to overstate its significance. The redistricting gamble has partially contributed to this reversal, and the national environment has done the rest. The bottom line is devastating for those who believe Texas would tilt the midterms. If Donald Trump and the Republican Party thought they could rig the game through map manipulation, they were sorely and catastrophically mistaken. The drama is now shifting to Virginia, where voters approved a congressional map giving Democrats the edge in upcoming elections, only to have a judge block certification of the results. The legal reasoning cited misleading language on the ballot and the legislature's failure to follow its own procedural rules for passing the referendum. The Virginia Supreme Court will ultimately resolve the issue in the coming weeks, but the uncertainty itself is generating chaos. Meanwhile, Republicans are increasingly viewing Florida as their last chance to regain any edge in the redistricting wars that President Trump set in motion. If you examine the states that have acted so far, Democrats could end up with a 1-seat advantage overall. The grand Republican scheme has produced results so meager they barely register. Democrats are now warning that a Florida gerrymander could actually backfire, putting GOP incumbents in greater danger rather than protecting them. Governor DeSantis' response to these concerns has been characteristically combative. He's been sounding off about critics in Washington, particularly those with leadership ambitions. He's offered to personally pay for certain House members to come campaign in Florida, promising to put them up in the governor's mansion, take them fishing, and roll out the red carpet. His message drips with sarcasm. Nothing could be better for Florida Republicans, he insists, than seeing certain national figures everywhere around the state. The bravado masks a deeper anxiety. The redistricting wars have not gone according to plan, and the person who set them in motion is watching his carefully constructed electoral fortress crumble. The Trump Republican gerrymandering scheme has failed. The question is why? The answer comes from a quote that perfectly captures the dynamic at play. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. The Republican plan was elaborate, multi-state, and coordinated at the highest levels. Then reality punched them in the mouth. The voters they were trying to disenfranchise fought back. The states they were trying to counterattack responded with their own redistricting measures. The national environment shifted in ways no amount of map manipulation could overcome. The plan looked brilliant on paper. In practice, it's been a disaster. The current landscape in Florida illustrates the stakes. Democrats currently hold 8 House seats in the Sunshine State, while Republicans command 20. If Florida moves forward with gerrymandered maps as part of the broader mid-decade effort that President Trump initiated, it could give Republicans a net gain of 2 seats before any votes are even cast. 2 seats sounds significant until you remember what this process was supposed to deliver. When Texas launched this entire endeavor, Republicans believed they would gain 5 seats from that state alone. The gap between expectation and reality has become a chasm. The best case scenario now is either a wash, +1 or +2. That's a far cry from the transformative advantage they anticipated. The political irony is rich enough to savor. President Trump and the Republican Party now find themselves in the position of needing to go hat in hand to Ron DeSantis of Florida. This is the same Ron DeSantis who challenged Trump in the primary, who endured months of attacks and ridicule from the MAGA movement, who was dismissed as disloyal for having the audacity to pursue his own presidential ambitions. Now they need him. Now they're asking him to jump to the rescue and deliver the redistricting advantage that might save their House majority. You could see DeSantis in that clip, relishing the moment, savoring the reversal of fortune. He's making them come to him. He's making them ask nicely. The dynamic is unmistakable. Redistricting and gerrymandering are arts, not sciences. The votes have to come from somewhere. And right now, they're slipping away faster than anyone anticipated. The legal hurdles keep mounting. In Virginia, the judge's decision to block certification has thrown yet another wrench into the Republican machinery. The Virginia Supreme Court will have the final say, and until they rule, the uncertainty persists. President Trump and his MAGA allies are melting down in response to these setbacks. Trump has baselessly claimed the election was rigged, trotting out the familiar scapegoats about mail-in ballots and phantom fraud. The pattern is so predictable at this point it barely registers as news. When Republicans win, the system works. When they lose, the system was corrupted. The excuses are prefabricated, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. But the most damning criticism isn't coming from Democrats. It's coming from voices within the Republican coalition who recognize a self-inflicted wound when they see one. Ari Fleischer, typically a reliable defender of Trump and a fierce partisan warrior, has delivered a brutal assessment. He points out that the GOP will now lose net seats across the country and offers a piece of advice that amounts to an indictment of the entire strategy. If you're going to pick a fight, at least win it. The other side will always fight back. Everything that has unfolded was foreseeable and avoidable. The whole mess should never have been started. When your own allies are saying you picked a fight you couldn't win and should have seen the consequences coming, you know the strategy has failed catastrophically. The historical context makes the Republican gamble even more bewildering. The party of the president almost always loses seats in midterm elections. This is one of the most reliable patterns in American politics, a gravitational force that exerts itself regardless of the specific circumstances. Presidential approval ratings have mathematical implications for what those losses will look like. The question for Republican strategists was always how to diminish the scale of the inevitable defeat, not how to prevent it entirely. The gerrymandering scheme, unprecedented in its scope and ambition, was designed to provide exactly that cushion. Instead, it's made the situation dramatically worse by provoking countermeasures and awakening Democratic voters who might otherwise have stayed home. The Supreme Court looms over all of these calculations. A ruling is expected soon on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and the implications for southern states in particular could be seismic. The uncertainty makes it impossible to predict exactly how the landscape will settle. Should Republicans have embarked on this path in the first place? The answer from thoughtful observers across the political spectrum is increasingly clear. No. Reducing the incentive to compromise is corrosive to the political system. No one wins in the long run when the rules of the game become weapons rather than neutral frameworks. Neither side emerges victorious from a process that delegitimizes democratic outcomes. The Texas situation deserves particular scrutiny because it reveals the hubris at the heart of the entire project. When the redistricting was happening, Republican voices were notably silent about the threat to democracy. There were no principled objections, no warnings about the dangerous precedent being set, no concerns raised about disenfranchising voters. Republicans across Texas and throughout the country had the opportunity to tell Donald Trump no. They could have insisted on fair maps, on competitive districts, on respecting the will of voters rather than manipulating boundaries for partisan advantage. But for reasons that remain difficult to fathom, they lacked the spine to stand up to him. Nobody wanted to be the one who said no. And now they find themselves in a situation where the very thing they refuse to oppose is consuming them. Republicans are suddenly discovering their concern for democracy, their worries about electoral integrity, their anxiety about the norms being shattered, but the crocodile tears aren't convincing anyone. The time to stand on principle was when the scheme was being launched, not when it's blowing up in your face. The irony extends to the comparative approaches taken by different states. When California passed its redistricting referendum, it went directly to the voters with a clear plan. Democrats in Virginia did the same thing. They made their case to the people. They secured a mandate. They operated in the open with transparent processes. Republicans took a different path entirely. They tried to operate under the cover of darkness, following the orders of a president who demands personal loyalty above all else, disregarding the needs and voices of the people they supposedly represent. In Virginia and California, the redistricting efforts carry the legitimacy of popular approval. In the red states that gerrymandered without seeking voter input, that legitimacy is entirely absent. The contrast matters because it speaks to which party is actually practicing democracy and which is merely paying it lip service while trying to rig the game. The Texas miscalculation is particularly acute because of how it's backfiring in multiple dimensions. Of the 5 districts that Texas attempted to tilt toward Republicans, the party won't win all 5. Winning 2 out of 5 would be considered lucky. The more likely outcome is that Democrats capture 3 because those districts are predominantly Hispanic areas where Republican support has been eroding. The gamble isn't just failing to produce gains. It's actively creating losses. Safe Republican seats were made less safe to marginally improve the party's position in purple districts. That trade-off only works if the marginally improved districts actually flip Republican. When they don't, the party has weakened its defenses without capturing any new territory. In a blue wave context, those weakened defenses become catastrophic vulnerabilities. Republicans have dummy-mandered themselves into a corner, and there's no escape hatch available. The broader national picture reveals a redistricting landscape that has essentially neutralized itself. When you add up all the Republican changes and all the Democratic changes across every state that has acted, the net result is virtually zero. The grand scheme to reshape the electoral map has produced a stalemate. But the national environment hasn't remained static during this process. It has shifted decisively toward Democrats. The Republican Party was going to lose seats in the midterms regardless of redistricting. That's what history and presidential approval numbers both indicated. The gerrymandering tactics might have reduced the scale of those losses slightly. Instead, by provoking Democratic countermeasures and energizing Democratic voters, they've likely increased the magnitude of the coming wave. The Democratic wave would likely have been too big to withstand even without the Republican provocations. But with Democrats now fighting back in states across the country, the gains are being amplified. Texas represents a net loss for Republicans in 2 distinct ways. First, Democrats are positioned to make bigger gains in other states because the national environment has shifted so dramatically. The resources that might have been spent defending vulnerable incumbents can now be deployed offensively against Republican-held seats that were supposed to be safe.